Kong Sheena, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Chair. Let us put ourselves in the most holy presence of the Lord, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that you have given all of us. We thank you for another day that you have added into our lives. Father, today as we celebrate the 34th anniversary of the 1987 Constitution, we pray for guidance and wisdom as we tackle important issues that our beloved nation is facing. We pray for wisdom and guidance for every person that is present here today in this committee hearing as we tackle whether or not to adopt important amendments to the fundamental law of the land. Father, we also pray for healing from the coronavirus for the Filipino people and the rest of the world. We lift up to you this time and we glorify you in everything that we do. This we all ask in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Kong Sheena. For the acknowledgement of House members and guests, may we ask the committee secretariat to acknowledge House members and resource persons who are present today. Comsec, you may proceed.
Good morning, Your Honors, our esteemed guests, and the viewing public. The committee would like to acknowledge the presence of the following members: Deputy Speaker Conrado Estrella, Deputy Majority Leader Juan Miguel Arroyo, Deputy Majority Leader Cristal Bagatsing, Senior Vice Chairman Antonio Tonipet Albano, Deputy Speaker Bernadette B.H. Herrera D., Representative Lawrence Law Fortun, Representative John Marvin Yul Servo Nieto, Representative Jose Jun Ong, Representative Sarah Jane Ilago, Deputy Speaker Geogracias Victor D.V. Savillano, Deputy Majority Leader Marilyn Len Alonte, Vice Chairman Ron Salo, Representative Franz Castro, Deputy Speaker Rogelio Ruel Pacquiao, Deputy Speaker Evelina Escudero, Representative Florida Rida Robes, Representative Eliza Sheena Tan, Representative Sharon Garin, Minority Leader Joseph Stephen Caraps Paduano, Deputy Minority Leader Stella Luz Kimbo, Deputy Speaker Isidro Ungab, Deputy Speaker Neftali Gonzalez, Deputy Speaker Rodante Marcoleta, Representative Ferdinand Gaite. The committee is also privileged to have esteemed resource persons who have graciously accepted the committee's invitation to attend this morning's meeting. These are the following: Justice Adolfo Ascuna, Chancellor of the Philippine Judicial Academy, and member of the 1986 Constitutional Commission. Ambassador Benedicto Yuhico, Chairman, Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Attorney Domingo Egon Cayosa, National President of the Integrated Bar of the Philippines. Former Secretary of Finance Margarito Gary Teves, also Fellow of the Foundation for Economic Freedom. Former Secretary of the Department of Energy and UP Law Professor, Attorney Rafael Lutilia. Attorney Anthony Abad, the Lecturer on International Law in the Ateneo School of Law. And we also welcome again Professor Dr. Bernardo Villegas, also a member of the 1986 Constitutional Commission. We also have again Mr. John Forbes of the American Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines. Also Mr. Julian Payne, President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines. And representing the Secretary of DOF is Attorney Bayanig Agabin of Undersecretary of DOF. And other members present, Your Honors, are Deputy Minority Leader Jose Christopher Kit Belmonte and Deputy Speaker Rose Marie Baby Arenas. That's all, Mr. Chair.
Comsec, let me also acknowledge physically present today in this Andaya Hall, Deputy Speaker Waminal Vice Chair Noy Defensor, Deputy Minority Leader Argel Kabatbat, the Senior Deputy Majority Leader Crispin Boyeng Rimulya, Congresswoman Franz Castro, Congressman Bong Suntay, and Congressman Bong Teves. Now, for the approval of the minutes of the previous meeting, may I solicit a motion?
Mr. Chair, I move to approve the minutes of our previous meeting held on January 26, 2021.
I second, Mr. Chair.
It's been seconded. Is there any objection? There being none, the minutes of the previous meeting is now approved. In attendance also is Deputy Speaker Singson Mihan and Congressman Dong Gonzales. Now let me greet you a happy Constitution Day. You know, February 2, today is the Philippine Constitution Day. And it is the 34th, it marks the 34th year of ratification of the 1987 Constitution. That's why we always say that we have a living Constitution. But it is far from being perfect, and that's why we are now in this committee proposing amendments to the restrictive economic provisions of the Constitution. And you know, when I was in law school, as many of you here are lawyers, I learned from the book of the late Justice Sagani Cruz that uh, there are qualities of a good written constitution. And some of the qualities is that it must be broad, brief, definite, or clear. It should be broad because it must not only provide for the organization of the entire government and cover all persons and things within the territory of the state, but more so because it is supposed to be or to embody the past, reflect the present, and anticipate the future. It must be comprehensive enough to provide for every contingency. It should not only imprison the past, but the unfolding of the future, to which it may be added that it should also be the fulfillment of the present. It must be brief, must confine itself to the basic principles to be implemented, with legislative details more adjustable to change and easier to amend. It must be definite or clear, less ambiguity in its provision, result in confusion and divisiveness. When the people ratified the 1987 Constitution containing the limitations of foreign ownership and participation in certain economic activities, it was their desire at that time to make the limitations specific. The Constitution, however, is not unchangeable. Apart from the procedural requirements prescribed in Article 17 of the 1987 Constitution, there are no other limitations imposed on the subjects and extent of the said amendment. When the people ratified the proposal to amend the Constitution to insert the phrase, unless otherwise provided by law, the people will be expressing their desire to make the limitations on foreign ownership and participation less rigid, and will be choosing to delegate to Congress the determination of what the appropriate limitations should be. It would be an acknowledgement that in this particular instances, the specific limitations would be an acknowledgement that in this particular instances, it is no longer wise and that there's a need for a quick, decisive, but deliberative action. Dr. Villegas, one of the framers of the 1987 Constitution and who chaired the national economy in the 1986 Constitutional Commission, summarized it in his position papers. And he said that it is wise for Congress to amend the Constitution by adding the phrase, unless otherwise specified by law, in order to give the government enough flexibility to consider different circumstances prevailing at different stages of a road to economic development before formulating policies that should be time-bound. He attested to the fact that they did not stick to writing the fundamental law, but because of the emotional state in which most of them were included in the Constitution, so many minute details that are more appropriate as legislative measures. In some instances, especially in matter affecting national security, they wore the hat of legislators rather than drafters of the Constitution. It is about time we correct this unintended anomaly by introducing an amendment that gives the Philippine legislature the freedom to amend those time-bound laws that have been enshrined in the Philippine Constitution to the detriment of the common good of the Filipinos now and in the future. That ends my preliminary remarks. Now, for the continuation of the deliberation of the resolution of both houses of Congress number 2, entitled Resolution of both houses proposing amendment to certain economic provisions of the 1987 Constitution of the Republic of the Philippines, particularly on Article 12, 14, and 16, authored by Speaker Lord Alan Velasco. We may now proceed with the opening statements of other guests. And first to state his position as a resort person on the proposed amendment to the 1987 Constitution is Justice Ascuna, the Chancellor, the Philippine Judicial Academy. If Justice Ascuna is ready, Justice Ascuna, you are now recognized.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this forum. And without further ado, I'd like to go into the substance of the proposed amendment. To start with, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to emphasize that the whole purpose of this proposed amendment, of which I was the original initiator. I proposed this to Speaker Belmonte some years back. The whole idea is to render changeable by legislation those restrictive economic provisions in our Constitution, which consisted of, as the chairman said, specific details as distinguished from bedrock principles, which should not be changed by legislation. The details can be changed by legislation and should be changed by legislation since they are not meant to last for a long time. Economic policy should be flexible. It should not be written in stone. And when we did write it in stone in the Constitution, I felt personally that we did not mean it to last for 34 years. And in fact, we provided that after 5 years, the Constitution may be amended even by initiative, by the people themselves. And so it is high time for us to look and review these restrictive economic provisions, especially during the time of the pandemic, when there is a need for our economy to recover from the negative impact of the pandemic. That said, Mr. Chairman, I would like to caution our honorable legislators that in framing or the amendment, the phrase "unless otherwise provided by law" must be strategically located so that what is restricted and what the restriction that is removed is only the flexible portion of the policy and not the permanent protective principle. For instance, the principle that we should protect our marine life, our marine territories. That is a permanent principle. That should not be unless otherwise provided by law. What is to be unless otherwise provided by law are the flexible portions such as the extent of foreign ownership that may be allowed in investment in that area. So depende po yan sa saan ninyo ilagay yung unless otherwise provided by law. kung ilagay ninyo yon sa dulo, lahat ng preceding provision will be changeable by law, which is not good because that includes the permanent principle of protecting our territory. So, paki-review lang po yung placement ng unless otherwise provided by law in the existing proposal so that we make sure that what is made changeable by legislation is only the extent of foreign ownership in the investment in this area. Maraming salamat po.
Are you done, Justice
I'm
Escuna?
done, Your Honor.
Thank you very much. Now, in the 16th Congress, you appeared in the Committee on Constitutional Amendments, and you expressed that the Constitution in Article 17 does not require Congress to sit in a joint assembly, but only requires that it does so upon a vote of 3/4 of all its members. Do you still espouse the same idea where Congress, as long as it comes within the terms of the 1987 Constitution, then they can propose amendment to the Constitution?
Mr. Chairman, I'm of the view that under Article 17, which is the provision on amending and revising the Constitution, Congress may, as a constituent body, propose amendments or even revisions, extensive changes to the Constitution by a vote of 3/4 of all its members. Ngayon, anong ibig sabihin ng 3/4 of all its members? I believe that it is 3/4 of the Senate and 3/4 of the House voting separately. Why? Because of the bicameral nature and structure of our legislative body, they have to act separately as when it comes to voting. Furthermore, Article 6 of our Constitution on legislative power says that Congress shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Therefore, those are the members of Congress. So when Article 17 speaks of 3/4 vote of all the members of Congress, it means 3/4 vote of the Senate and of the House. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And you are also of the view, Justice Escuna, that there's no prior act for Congress, or there's no need for prior act for Congress to call for a constituent assembly in order to propose amendment to the Constitution. The moment Congress, meaning the House and the Senate, in its initiatory stage, even in the committee level, propose amendment to the Constitution, they are already exercising their constituent power. Is that your view, Justice Escuna?
That is the view of Father Bernas, Mr. Chairman. I am of the view that in order to exercise powers, constituent powers, under Article 17, as distinguished from legislative powers under Article 6, there has to be some action on the part of Congress to show that they're acting now no longer as a legislative body, but as a constituent assembly. And that can be done by a joint resolution, perhaps, but there should be some signal so that the people will know that they are not passing ordinary laws, but they are proposing amendments or revisions to the Constitution.
And isn't it true, Justice Escuna, that the Constitution has given Congress the power to determine its own rules, including the rules on how Congress may propose amendments or revision to the Constitution under Article 6?
That is not very clear, Mr. Chairman, because the power to adopt rules is found in Article 6, and Article 6 refers to Congress acting as a legislative body, making ordinary laws. Therefore, whether or not it can adopt rules on how it will propose amendments to the Constitution, perhaps it can, but it's not tested. It will be tested in the Supreme Court when the time comes.
Is it also your view, Justice Escuna, that the Constitution made Congress both as an ordinary legislative body under Article 6 of the 1987 Constitution and a constituent assembly under Article 17 of the Constitution.
Uh, Yes, Mr. Chairman, the Congress has a dual character under our Constitution. It can act as an ordinary legislative body under Article 6 or as a constituent assembly properly constituted under Article 17.
Can you expound, Justice Ascuna, when you state properly constituted?
There has to be some signal, some sign that Congress is no longer acting as an ordinary legislative body, but exercising constituent powers. And that can be done, it's up to them. They can adopt a joint resolution to that effect or pass a law providing for the procedure by which it may exercise constituent powers.
Thank you, Justice Ascuna. There are no other Congressman. The senior deputy majority leader would like to ask some question. Justice Ascuna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask the good justice about when we have a constituent assembly, does it have to be Congress in joint session assembled, or may we discuss these matters as independent bodies or separate bodies? What is your view on this matter, Justice Ascuna?
Thank you, Honorable Congressman. I personally believe that when Congress acts as a constituent body to consider proposed amendments or revisions to the Constitution, the Senate and the House, as the members of Congress, should sit jointly. Why? Because in most cases in the Constitution, when Congress is deliberating on very important matters, not as a constituent assembly, but as a legislative body. But for instance, martial law, they are asked to act in joint session, and in joint session they can hear each other, deliberate on the specific matter, and share each other's views and wisdom. But that is the preferred view, but it's not required by the Constitution. As long as it is Congress deliberating, they can do it separately, as long as the voting is not joint, because I think the Constitution is very clear that it should be 3/4 of all the members, and members means Senate and House.
Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman, may I be recognized?
May I have a follow-up question, Mr. Chairman?
You may proceed, Deputy Majority Leader Boying, and then you will to be followed by Vice Chair Noy Defensor.
Thank you. So in this sense, Mr. Justice, when I was reading on the deliberations of the Constitutional Commission, there were big debates on the votes of the Senate and the House, especially on the martial law provisions and the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. And in these debates, it appeared that the intent of the framers of the Constitution, at least it was made clear by Commissioner Monsod and Commissioner Rodrigo, that they wanted to avoid a deadlock. That's why they had to vote jointly on this matter of martial law and the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. They have wanted to avoid deadlocks in the, let's say, it could happen that the House would vote separately. If they voted separately, the House may take it up, but the Senate will refuse, or the Senate may take it up, but the House may refuse. Then there will be a deadlock. That's why. But there was a safety provision put in where judicial review became available after 60 days. But this is the only case. There are only 2 cases probably in the Constitution where voting jointly happens. One is there in the martial law provisions, which was fiercely debated. And second, where it was not clarified and it was made the literal interpretation of the Constitution, literal words of the Constitution is 3/4 of Congress proposing amendments to the Constitution. Meaning to say, those two those two provisions, there may be a similarity of design that the commissioners who were debating on these measures wanted to avoid a deadlock, because if the Senate refuses to take up charter change, what will happen to charter change? Then it's a dead charter change. It will never take off. Or if the House refuses to take it up, it's the same thing. Don't you think, Mr. Justice, that this may be an intent of the framers, that for the Constitution to be subject to amendment, you have to have the two houses voting jointly, such as those found in the martial law provisions and the habeas corpus provisions, Mr. Justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Andaya. I have occasion to look into that point, and it is true that there are some provisions, one or two, which says that Congress should vote jointly. Okay.
Yung video wala
But
na.
in the
Nanonood
case
lang.
of amending
Oo.
the Constitution, Mr. Chairman, what it says is that by a vote of 3/4 of all its members, not a vote of 3/4 of Congress. It says by a vote of 3/4 of all its members. Now, as I said, its members under Article 6 are not the individuals, senator or individual representative. It is the Senate and the House. So that means 3/4 of the Senate and 3/4 of the House. However, Mr. Chairman, if I should be wrong, and the voting is by individuals, not by the constituent House and Senate, so that you count heads of every senator and every representative, and 3/4 of the total is enough. I still submit, Your Honor, that in that eventuality, a joint voting should include at least a majority of the Senate, at least a majority. Perhaps an absolute majority would be required, that is 13. Why? Because if you do not have a majority of the Senate, then the action is not an act of the Senate. If it is not an act of the Senate, it is not an act of Congress, because Congress is Senate and House. And therefore, to be valid, even a joint voting must include at least a majority of the Senate. Doesn't have to be 3/4, but at least a majority, I would say absolute majority, 13 of the Senate must vote in favor. Otherwise, I believe that the proposal would be invalid.
Yeah, for your last manifestation,
Yes.
comboing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Mr. Justice, I was reading up on the case of Gonzalez versus Comelec, where it was stated, maybe in obiter, but still stated by the Supreme Court, that when Congress starts discussing and then when Congress starts working on the Constitution, it ceases to be a legislative body. It becomes one that takes up matters of the sovereign. And in doing so, we cease to become members of different houses. That is what Gonzalez versus Comelec said. What would you say? What would be your stand on this case, Mr. Justice?
I do not agree that I agree perhaps in Father Berna's view that the process of proposing amendments to the Constitution may be done in the same way that you propose a bill. No, you pass it like a bill, propose it in the House, propose it in the Senate, and then approve it, sent to the upper chamber. In other words, you follow the procedure for passing an ordinary legislation. but you need 3/4 vote, according to Father Bernas, both in the Senate and in the House. To say that because the moment you start talking about amending the Constitution, you become a constituent assembly and therefore no longer two chambers, I don't think that's correct, because the one that is given power to amend and revise the Constitution under Article 17 is a two-chamber body, Congress. Congress is defined under Article 6 as a two-chamber body. So simply because you are proposing amendments under Article 17 doesn't mean that Article 6 composition of Congress ceases, because Article 17 must be read in relation with Article 6 when it speaks of Congress. Who is Congress? Who is this body that can propose amendments? You have to go to Article 6, and it says Senate and House.
So the good justice does not believe in the words stated by the ponente in Gonzalez versus Comelec. Is that my reading of the words of the good justice?
Yes, I do not think that's binding. That is probably an obiter dictum, because there has never happened yet a situation where only one chamber and the Senate did not participate as a Senate, and the amendment was sustained.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Congressman Boying Rimulya. Pagpasensya nyo na ako at ililimit ako muna yung interpellation, asking question to Justice Ascuna. But I will, pagpapibigyan ko lang yung mga nakapagpalista na. Vice Chair Noy Defensor, D.S. Marcoleta, Deputy Speaker Dinan Hernandez, and Congressman Lo Fortun. And after the four who have mentioned, Kong Argel, five have mentioned, we will proceed with other resource person who will also deliver their position paper, their position on RBH2. Thank you. Kong Noy, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Justice, you earlier mentioned that there is a need for Congress to signify that it is acting or exercising its constituent power to be able to discuss or propose amendments to the Constitution. But is the filing by any member of Congress of a resolution of both houses and the referral by the plenary of Congress to a committee on constitutional amendments, are they not a clear sign that a member of Congress or a component of Congress, such as the House of Representatives, is already exercising its constituent power to propose amendments to the Constitution? What is your view on that, Mr. Justice? Thank you.
I believe, Mr. Congressman, that the filing of a joint resolution to propose amendment to the Constitution is sufficient signal that if adopted, such action converts the legislature into a constituent assembly.
Thank you, Mr. Justice. Chairman.
Thank you, Kong Noy, Kong Argel, and then to be followed by Kong Lu Fortun.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Justice, sir,
Yes.
I would like to ask your opinion about matters of style. You see, Mr. Chair, Mr. Justice, we are 10, 20, or 30 years from now, if our amendments here are approved through a plebiscite, one law student might chance upon our work here, and that law student might read, say, for example, Section 11 about the ownership of mass media. On the first part of the sentence, it says there that it is limited to citizens of the Philippines, unless otherwise provided by law. And that law student might give a comment that this is superfluous, this is verbose. Why not remove the entire provision, and it will have the same effect of, allowing allowing foreigners to own mass media. You see, the reason why I'm bringing that up is because we are tinkering here with the Philippine Constitution. it should be the best well-written piece of document in the country. So I would like to ask if you share the same vision that this can still be improved. If we agree on in principle that we are opening up our economy, perhaps in the subsequent procedures we can change this so it will be better written, involve other members of Congress to add their inputs so that we can come up with the best version of the Constitution that we can get. Mr. Justice, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. As the saying goes, when you deal with crucial matters, you can leave elegance to the tailor. What is important is clarity. Clarity. It may not be in the best prose, but as long as it's clear, it is, for me, sufficient drafting. But I agree with you. If it can be improved to make it more acceptable in terms of aesthetics, why not? But we have to be careful that in trying to make it beautiful, you might be miscommunicating the essence of what you want to communicate. So clarity first, then style later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Justice, Mr. Chair. I have no further questions.
Deputy Speaker, Dinan Hernandez, you want to say something?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is just a reiteration of the earlier statement of Justice Ascuna that Justice, this is just to confirm your statement that you agreed with the question of our colleague Congressman Defensor that as far as compliance with the Constitution and as far as compliance with the procedure in amending the Constitution, the joint resolution that has been acted on the plenary and referred to the Committee on Justice for deliberation, constitutional amendments are enough compliance as far as amending the Constitution.
Let me clarify that. Joint resolution means both Senate and House must adopt it, not just the House. Joint with the Senate yun eh. So if it's adopted according to your rules, the rules of the Senate and the rules of the House, and adopted by the both Senate and House, then it is sufficient signal that you are proposing to act as a body under Article 17. What I only think is required is a clear signal that you are no longer going to act as an ordinary legislature under Article 6. But this has to be joint because don't forget the Senate. This is a bicameral legislative body. So it should be joint resolution by both House and Senate.
Well, Justice, after the committee will act and vote on the proposal to amend the Constitution, this will be again forwarded to Senate for them to act. Again, my question is that with the procedure Congress is adopting now, there's a resolution, the committee acted on the amendments and later on might vote on it. I think that's more than enough in terms of compliance with informing the public that we are amending the Constitution, and this in fact gained so much public attention as far as what we're doing right now. I think that's more than enough compliance as far as telling everybody that we are acting and amending the Constitution.
Correction, Mr. Chairman. You are not amending the Constitution. You are merely proposing to amend the Constitution. It's the people who will amend the Constitution. You have to submit that to the people first. So all you're doing is signaling to the people that you wish now to act as amendments to the Constitution.
So,
Not to amend, to propose amendments.
so would you agree, Justice, that we have complied with our internal procedure as far as proposing to amend the Constitution?
Yes, I agree that the present procedure you're following, that is through resolution of both houses, is the proper procedure for proposing amendments to the Constitution.
So I think that's all, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Next to be recognized is Deputy Speaker Marcoleta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning po, Mr. Justice.
You may proceed,
Chair.
Deputy Speaker.
Naririnig ba, Mr. Chair?
Naririnig ka, loud and clear. And
Mr. Justice, good morning po.
Good morning.
Good morning po. You premise the argument that it should be 3/4 of the Senate and 3/4 of the House simply because Congress is bicameral. That is your claim, sir. But there are activities and there are actions being done by Congress which are not bicameral. For example, the power to initiate all cases of impeachment is exclusively conferred to the House of Representatives. That's not bicameral. The power to try and decide all cases of impeachment is the sole responsibility of the Senate. That is not bicameral. In Section 21, Article 7, Mr. Justice, a treaty or international agreement shall be valid and effective only if concurred in by at least 2/3 of all the members of Senate. Hindi po kami kasama doon. That is not bicameral. So if the argument is because Congress is bicameral in nature, we will always have the vote of 3/4 of Senate and 3/4 of the House. It does not compute, Mr. Justice, with all due respect. My view, which is shared also by several of my co-members, is that it should be joint voting because even in the, for example, as the one cited by Kong Boying, in revoking the proclamation of martial law, Sir Justice, it only requires a majority vote of all the members of Congress voting jointly. If in that particular position, and the Constitutional Commission at that time was emotional in being able to craft a particular provision relating to martial law, it only required majority vote of all the members. And joint voting was the most convenient way of doing this because ang position po natin doon, kinakailangan madaliin na i-revoke ang martial law. But in this particular case, we're only proposing, as you said, we are not amending the Constitution directly. We're just proposing. And that is not legislation. Doon po sa sinabi ni Kong Boying, that was not obiter dictum, Mr. Justice, with all due respect, because it was also re-articulated in Sanidad versus Comelec as well as in Tolentino versus Comelec. It has been the unanimous statement made in those jurisprudence that when we are entering into this power, Mr. Justice, we are component elements of a constituent assembly, not doing legislation per se. So you should be able to allow us by joint voting. Otherwise po, tama si Kong Boying, kung sakaling hindi po papayag yung Senate, lahat po ng pinagpapaguran namin dito, wala ring mangyayari. And we will never be able to amend the Constitution under the circumstances of 3/4 Senate and House of Representatives.
Thank you, Representative Dante, my good friend. I respect your opinion, sir, but I have the view that Article 17, in saying that in proposing amendments or revisions, Congress needs 3/4 vote of all its members. It speaks of Congress, not of the House or the Senate. When the Constitution says that impeachment shall be done by the House, it doesn't say Congress, it says House. When the Constitution says that the treaties should be ratified by the Senate, it says Senate, it doesn't say House or Senate. It doesn't say Congress, it says Senate. So if Article 17 had wanted the House to be able to propose amendments, it would have said proposed by the Senate, Congress, instead of saying Congress, it should have said Senate or House, or it should have said the Senate or the House, but it says Congress. And so we have to go back to Article 6. What is Congress? Congress is Senate and House. That is
Sir,
why-
under Section 4,
that is
under
why-
Section 4, Article 18, which is a transitory provision or constitution, sabi po dito, all existing treaties or international agreements which have not been ratified shall not be renewed or extended without the concurrence of at least 2/3 of all the members of Senate. Hindi rin po bicameral yun eh. Mr. Justice, ang sinasabi lamang po namin dito, para po magkaroon ng pagkakataon na talaga namang dapat baguhin po yung restrictive provisions. Huwag na sana pong gawin sa mahirap na paraan kung sakasakali po na hindi namin makuha yung 3/4 ng Senate, hindi rin po magkakaroon ng katuparan anuman ang gawin namin dito sa House of Representatives. What we are trying to say here is, hindi naman sa lahat po ng pagkakataon, kagaya po ng mga ipinaliwanag kong provisions, pinapayagan naman kami ang House of Representatives at ang Senate sa kanyang sarili din. Gumagawa rin po kami, but these are also constituent functions. Hindi naman po legislation yun. In the same manner that the proposal to amend the Constitution is not a legislative function. It is only one of our constituent functions. So sa tingin po namin, with all due respect po, kailangan po siguro joint voting na lang. At tama po kayo, siguro kung makakuha tayo ng at least majority from the members of the Senate, which I do not doubt we will be able to do, yung joint voting po is the most, I think, more practical and reasonable way to process this particular exercise, Mr. Justice. Then I will now go to my second question. Mr. Justice, hindi po namin kasi masyadong alam kung paano ang magiging direksyon ng future Congress. Let's say we will leave the phrase as maybe provided by law. We will be leaving to the future Congress all the discretion, the wisdom of amending in whatever form as the need arises. Sila na po ang bahala doon. But you will see, Mr. Justice, under Article 2, Section 19 of the State Policies of the Constitution, nakalagay po doon eh. Ang sabi po, the state shall develop a self-reliant and independent national economy effectively controlled by Filipinos. Mr. Justice, in my view, this particular provision is not only categorical, it is fundamental, it is ultimate, and it is even absolute. So, baka po magkakaroon po ng violation the future Congress at maaring kami din, nangangamba rin kami, in the presence of this very restrictive state policy na kayo rin naman po ay kasama yata sa gumawa ng Constitution, it has been a state policy. Until and unless this state policy is relaxed to a certain extent to allow whatever amendments we will do now and in the future, Mr. Justice. Salamat po sa advice po ninyo. Sana matugunan ninyo ang munting katanungan ito.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker Marcoleta. Mr. Justice, you may now answer.
Yes, thank you for that point. Precisely, I said earlier that in the Constitution, you have both bedrock principles as well as flexible provisions. The flexible provisions are those in the economic provisions referring to the extent of foreign ownership in the areas concerned. However, the bedrock principle remains that we want an economy effectively controlled by Filipinos. That should not be unless otherwise provided by law. Please don't touch that. What you can touch in this exercise is the extent of foreign ownership. Right now, it's 60-40. You can make it 51-49. It's still Filipino. It's still Filipino. In Spain, it's 51-49. So I'm not saying that you leave it completely. You cannot, because you're still governed by the statement of state policies in Article 2. Furthermore, you can impose reciprocity. You can say, unless otherwise provided by law, subject to reciprocity. Ilagay ninyo yon sa amendment ng Constitution so that hindi tayo dihado. Nabigay tayo ng bigay dito, pero yung mga Pilipino hindi pwedeng gumawa ng ginagawa nila dito sa atin sa kanilang bayan. So I would suggest that in addition to the word unless others provided by law, ilagay natin subject to reciprocity.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you po, Mr. Justice.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker Marcoleta, Justice Mascuna. May also recognize present in Zoom the Deputy or the Majority Leader, Martin Romualdez. Madjo, magandang umaga sa inyo. Deputy Speaker Atienza, Deputy Speaker Revilla, Deputy Speaker Divine Grace Yu, Deputy Speaker Martinez, Congressman Sagarbaria, Deputy Majority Leader Romualdo, Congressman Mendoza, Deputy Majority Leader Bolilia, Deputy Speaker Abante, Congresswoman Kulyamat, Deputy Majority Leader Agabas, Deputy or Congressman Tijada, Deputy Speaker Rimpi Bondok, Deputy Majority Leader Tof De Venecia, and Congressman Suarez. The last to ask question before we proceed on the continuation of the statements of other resource person is Congressman Lo Fortun. Congressman Lo, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sir Justice, sir, what we have now before the committee is a resolution of both houses. That's how it is called. That's how it is labeled when it was filed in the House. Then the Committee on Rules referred this resolution of both houses to the Committee on Constitutional Amendments. And now we are tackling the specific proposals contained in the resolution. There is no adoption yet of the resolution of both houses, neither by the House nor the Senate. My question, sir, is the committee in its function now already functioning as a constituent assembly?
The committee is, to my mind, taking preparatory steps already for Congress to act as a constituent assembly. But until the resolution is adopted, as I said, and passed by the necessary votes, then I believe that the act of converting yourself into a constituent assembly is not completed. So there are stages, and you are taking the steps correctly, I think, towards becoming a body that can propose amendments to the Constitution.
In other words, Mr. Justice, what the committee is now doing is trying to come up with proposed amendments that would be formally proposed to the Constituent Assembly for it to adopt.
Yes, if the House and the Senate versions coalesce, in other words, you can agree on the proposed amendments, and you have the necessary votes, then at that point in time, I would say you are a constituent assembly that can validly propose amendments. But until then, you are in the process of attaining that level of being able to propose amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Justice. In other words, what the committee is now doing is doing its preparatory work, to come up with proposed amendments that will later on be maybe adopted by the Constituent Assembly. In the meantime, there is no Constituent Assembly to speak of yet.
Yes, it's a gray area. I think Justice Carpio proposes that what you should do is first pass a law that will provide the mechanics by which Congress can propose amendments, including a common agenda, including the voting required, and then have this law challenged in the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court says that the law is valid, then you proceed to follow that law to propose amendments. But absent that law, it doesn't mean that you cannot propose amendments. Father Berna says you can do it like an ordinary legislation, as long as in the end you have the required votes and it's clear that your intention is to propose amendments to the Constitution, then it's a valid proposal according to Father Bernas. What is essential is, I think, the voting. Is it sufficient to have mere 3/4 of both houses? That is 200 plus 24, 3/4 of that. Is that enough? Or should it be 3/4 of the Senate and 3/4 of the House? Dapat magkasundo kayo doon. Otherwise, hindi maamin itong constitution na ito.
As the last question, Mr. Justice, sir, isn't it not that when Congress, both houses, constitutes itself as a constituent assembly, it is no longer functioning as a legislature, in which case the bicameral nature does not apply anymore. And in which case, Mr. Justice, the voting would not be separate, but rather joint, because it is already one constituent assembly.
I respectfully disagree, Your Honor, because even as a constituent assembly, you're still referred to by the Constitution as Congress, and therefore you're still bicameral.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Justice.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much,
Mr. Chair.
Konglo Fortun and Justice Ascuna. Now to proceed with the opening statements of other resource person, I now acknowledge the President of the Integrated Bar of the Philippines, Attorney Domingo Cayosa. You are now recognized.
Good morning, Your Honors. We thank Chair Garbin and the members of the House of Representatives for inviting IBP to this committee hearing. There are over 75,000 Filipino lawyers, and we can have as many opinions and views on constitutional amendments and its different aspects. Nevertheless, your Integrated Bar of the Philippines, as a responsible organization, has to respond when asked by Congress to input on matters of public and national interest, especially on matters regarding the Constitution, which every Filipino lawyer has sworn to uphold. Your Honors, Honorable Chair Garbin, the inputs that I am sharing now as IBP National President are culled from interactions with IBP officials, chapters, members in different fora over time. Number one, the 1987 Constitution is 34 years old. It is not perfect. It has been tested. There are gaps, ambiguities, gray areas, and issues regarding some provisions. The 1987 Constitution can, and if I may add, should be improved. There may be differences as to how the Constitution may be improved and the timing, but we have to respect the options provided by the Constitution, con-as, initiative, and referendum. The elected representatives of the people, we believe, may have a better appreciation of the pulse of the nation than any one of us. Number three, numerous attempts to improve the Constitution have been derailed mired in politics, propaganda, doubts, and unfortunate accusations of bad faith and vested interests. One workable approach to improve our Constitution is to focus on specific areas or provisions. Specificity and transparency on the process and the items to be amended or improved would be most helpful. Looking at things from a global perspective would help make our country more competitive in an increasingly globalized economic and legal order. Number four, with respect to the often discussed, or I think the focus of the Congress now, on economic provisions, we submit that the phrase "unless otherwise provided for by law" should apply to flexible portions of the cited provisions, not necessarily on the fundamental principles in the Constitution. It may also be prudent to include parameters such as national security, long-term interest, empirical data, or even reciprocity to guide our honorable lawmakers in providing for by law these refinements in these economic provisions. Number five, the Integrated Bar of the Philippines is ready and willing to contribute to a robust discourse on the proposals and objectively educate our people on the timing, the process, and the subjects of constitutional improvements. Our 87 chapters can be tapped to enlighten the Filipino voters all over the country who, at the end of the day, Your Honors, will have to decide through their individual votes whether or not the proposed amendments should pass. This is something that IBP is willing to work on in cooperation with Congress and our country. Lastly, as the provisions proposed to be improved and the matter and timing therefore crystallize, we at IBP can and will conduct more detailed and organized consultation within our organization and submit a more detailed and formal results to Congress. As we thank you for considering our inputs, we assure you that your Integrated Bar of the Philippines, the Filipino lawyer, will do its share in contributing to nation building and improving our Constitution. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Attorney Domingo Cayosa, the IBP National President. Let me acknowledge also in attendance is the Vice Chairperson, the 4th District of the 1st District of Davao Oriental, Congresswoman Malanyaon, Deputy Majority Leader Ria Fariñas, the 1st District of Ilocos Norte, and the Deputy Minority Leader Sarate of Bayan Muna Party List. To proceed for the...
Good morning, Mr. Chair.
Yes. Please acknowledge, please identify yourself. Congressman Sarate, you're now recognized. You want to say something? O nagpa-present lang? Now to proceed with our resource person, we have also the President of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, PCCI, Ambassador Benedicto Uico. The President, you're now recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Chairman.
Rep Kaloy, Mr. Chair. Nag-greet lang po ako ng good morning.
Thank you, Kong Kaloy.
No, I just greeted you, Mr. Chair. Good morning.
Ambassador Uico, you're now recognized, please.
Thank you, Honorable Chairman and honorable members of the committee. We at the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, thank you for giving us the opportunity to voice our position on the proposed amendments. From our viewpoint, there are three general issues. Number one, the issue of what? Number two, the issue of when. And number three, how should amendments be undertaken? On the first, in general, the proposed amendment, which simply adds the phrase unless otherwise provided by law to certain sections in Article 12, 14, and 16, provides flexibility by allowing Congress to amend the proportions or percentages of ownership and control stated in the Constitution. The Constitution was prepared 34 years ago when the prevailing idea was Filipino first. Now and in the future, the world has and may continue to change. So must our country and economy. The debate, even within PCCI, is not whether certain nationalistic provisions should be changed by allowing foreigners to have more equity or even control of certain enterprises and or activities. This, for us, is already a given, and we appreciate that the local business groups are given the opportunity to raise our opinion on the subject. Which industries or businesses? Number two, in what percentages? And number three, when in terms of time or dates, should the relaxation be made, are debated and decided by this body in consultation with affected stakeholders. The issue boils down to the question of time and of priority. Will Congress have enough time to deliberate on the amendment fully and wisely, given the present pandemic and the many measures to help us overcome the problems it has brought, like poverty, unemployment, and joblessness? If Congress can pass the measures to help us recover from the pandemic, including the long-pending CREATE bill, to solve or alleviate our problems while still attending to the amendment, then well and good. The third issue is legalistic. Should Congress convene, deliberate, and vote jointly or separately? I leave this to you and our expert lawyers, since it will be constitutionally and legally contentious. Thank you all, and good morning.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Congressman Suntay.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, with regards to the one concern earlier raised, I would just like to manifest that just yesterday afternoon, the CREATE bill was approved by the bicameral conference committee. So it is safe to say that it is just ratified by Congress and merely awaits the signature of the president.
Thank you for that information, Kong Bong Suntay. In fact, I think the chair of the Committee on Ways and Means is present in Zoom and will attest to the fact that the CREATE bill was finished in the bicameral conference committee and awaiting the ratification of both houses of Congress. Let me also inform those who are in attendance and those who are watching or Zoom that aside from CREATE, this House already passed on third reading the Public Service Act along with the Retail Trade Liberalization Act. And so, Liberalization Bill. And so, the contention of this committee and of the leadership of the House is while we focus on those low-hanging fruits, we may also resolve the issue on lifting the restrictive economic provisions of the Constitution as a way of forward planning, anticipatory planning, and part of the long-term strategic solution in fighting this economic problem caused about by the pandemic. So to proceed, let me acknowledge
Mr. Chairman, may I comment, please?
Yes, Ambassador, you may.
Well, we thank the Congress for passing all of these laws because surely CREATE and the other laws that have been passed will help. However, I would just like to emphasize that this pandemic actually started in January, February, hit us very hard with lockdowns in April. And since April, even up to now, our MSMEs, which are the bulk of our membership, many thousands of them are still struggling, are still waiting for the implementation and smooth delivery of whatever benefits or assistance this and other provisions may provide. I guarantee you, there has not been any substantial support or assistance that has reached our MSMEs. I guarantee you, a lot of them are still closed. A lot of them are still struggling. A lot of them cannot even hire back the employees. So on the practical side, Honorable Chairman, we are aware of all of these laws, but we are still, we in business, we in PCCI, we are represented. When I make these comments, please be aware that PCCI is the biggest organization, business organization in the country, and we are represented all over the country with our area vice presidents, with our regional governors, and with our chapter presidents. So the comment that I have given, where we in business, particularly the MSMEs, are still waiting for whatever economic stimulus can be given to us, still is not present. So I would just like to know that this is a comment that I believe should be ventilated so that whatever your honorable gentlemen can do to accelerate the process of delivering the economic stimulus to our long-suffering MSMEs would be greatly appreciated. Our concern is there's no delivery yet, and we are talking of additional things that we are going to do to help business. So I humbly and I very respectfully suggest, please take a look at how to expedite this. MSMEs really need your help.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Maraming salamat po.
As you know,
Mr. Chairman.
yes, as you know, this House or Congress was able to pass Bayanihan 1 and Bayanihan 2 on time, which includes stimulus package for MSME, meaning that the House of Representatives had already this budget authorization to the executive. And not only that, when we approved the 2021 budget, the House and then the Senate approved it on time and signed by the President into law on time. Now, as to the robust pandemic response needed, we already authorized those budget authorization. And it's up to the executive. Congressman Sunday, before you speak, I think there are still proposals to stimulate the economy just like Arise and the third Bayanihan bill now pending before the House of Representatives. I think Congresswoman Stella Kimbo would like to share her views on the Arise bill and on the Bayanihan 3 now pending before the House of Representatives on a later date. After we finish the fourth resource person to deliver his position. Congressman Bong Sontay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I fully understand the concern of the good ambassador. It is likewise a concern which the concern of Congress. But of course, because of the separation of power, the responsibility of Congress is to legislate the laws. In fact, we work very hard to push for its the approval of the said law. Now it is up to the executive to implement the legislation passed by Congress, and hopefully the SMEs would eventually feel the benefits of the laws passed by Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Suntay. In attendance also is Deputy Speaker Camille Villar, Deputy Majority Leader Lacson Noel, and to proceed, may I now acknowledge the former Secretary of Department of Energy, Attorney Rafael Lutilia. Sir, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members of the committee. I would just like to focus on a number of things. First, I fully agree with the committee's proposals recognizing the need for amendments to the economic provisions of the Constitution, because the current constraints restrict not only the quantity of foreign investments, but also reduce the quality of those investments, because only those foreign investors with no regard for constitutional limits and violations of law will come in, whereas the ones who are more law-abiding are not going to try to get around these limitations. Secondly, I think they need to enhance the confidence of our people in the process is something that you have tried to address. And I would just want to emphasize that the clear preconditions for charter changes must therefore be drawn as to content limited only to the economy, as to timing presented to the people in a plebiscite only in the next presidential elections and effective only in the next presidential term, and as to mode of adoption, Congress as a constituent assembly voting separately would meet the requirements of speed and balance. Now, any departure, however, from these would likely invite heightened public suspicion and enhance the chances of failure.
Picture.
Limiting the scope of the amendments, to me, the clear signals that Justice Ascuna was citing include, for example, in the title of your joint resolution, may I suggest that it be the final output should be titled Constituent Assembly Joint Resolution, in which case the title itself clearly signals what type of power the House and the Senate will be exercising. Now, on the language, I would like to the committee to consider is to have an omnibus phrase which would state the citizenship requirements and preferences contained in the following provisions of the Constitution shall remain in force unless otherwise provided by law. Then we enumerate the specific provisions of the Constitution that can be subject to change by Congress. In that particular case, what is relevant is that it would identify or exclude the bedrock principles and only limit it to the details left to legislation. And Mr. Chairman, I also propose this because there are certain provisions of the Constitution that have been interpreted which constrict the entry of foreign investments. I refer to Section 10, Paragraph 2, in the grant of rights, privileges, and concessions covering the national economy and patrimony, the state shall give preference to qualified Filipinos. And in the Manila Hotel case, that was interpreted in a manner that is unfair to those who participated in the bidding. So inclusion of this provision, which does not provide for a nationality requirement, will, however, clarify the issues without need to resort to the courts, which is not time bound, nor its outcome certain. The other alternative, Mr. Chairman, is to lift immediately the constitutional limitations unless Congress acts to legislate these same limitations. This alternative will accelerate the speed of implementation and implements the urgency of opening the economy to quality foreign investments in the aftermath of the raging pandemic. The alternative states the proposed amendment in the manner outlined as follows. The prefatory statement would just say the citizenship requirements and preferences contained in the following provisions of the Constitution and their implementing laws shall cease to be enforced unless otherwise provided hereafter by law. So in that particular case, it will be followed by an enumeration of the provisions that would be amended. Finally, please note that the ownership of land does not need to be included, as there is no longer an express prohibition in the 1987 Constitution on foreign ownership of land. Congress is free to legislate on the matter, since the Constitution's approach is to expressly specify citizenship requirements where it prescribes the same. Unlike in the 1935 and 1973 Constitutions, the 1987 Constitution inadvertently failed to include an antecedent provision to Section 7 that states, save in cases of hereditary succession, no private land shall be transferred or conveyed except to individuals, corporations, or associations qualified to acquire or hold lands of the public domain. That limitation now only appears in legislation, particularly the Public Land Act, and therefore the contentious issue about land can be excluded from this discussion. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would limit myself to those and would submit to you an appropriate language. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes our 4 resource persons who were able to deliver their position on this matter. But before we continue, Comsec, please ascertain how many members are present today.
Mr. Chairman, the members who are physically present in Andaya Hall are 9, and in Zoom there are 45, Your Honor. So a total of 54 members.
So is that a sufficient quorum to transact business?
Yes, Your Honor. The minimum requirement for quorum for this committee having 55 members is only 11.
There
So
being
it's
a quorum,
surpassed.
we can continue to transact business in the committee. Now to proceed,
Mr. Chair.
We have a line of interpellators right now. May I advise our resource person as well as those resource person who delivered their position in the previous hearing. And may I acknowledge Dr. Villegas, one of the framers of the Constitution. Present also is Mr. John Forbes of the American Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Julian Payne, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Please stay with us. There are questions to be asked by members of this committee. Now, Concit Belmonte, the Deputy Minority Leader, you want to say something?
Yes, Mr. Chair, if I may be allowed to just propound one question, Mr. Chair.
Concit, there are sequence of interpellators here.
I will
And
follow at the appropriate time. No problem, Mr. Chair.
yes. So it is now the time of Deputy Minority Leader, Congresswoman Stella Kimbo, to ask question. Kong Stella, you are now recognized.
There should be a balance. Mr. Chair.
You are
Mr.
now
Chair.
recognized. You may proceed.
I don't have questions at this point. I'll just yield my time to Kong Kit Belmonte, Mr. Chair.
Congressman Kit Belmonte, you are now recognized.
Wow. Thank you very much, Congresswoman Kimbo. Just one question. I hesitated to ask from Justice Ascuna a while ago, Mr. Chair, kasi row 4 po ako, nasindak po ako Supreme Court Justice. Pero I would like to specifically kay Attorney Lutilia, and maybe the resource persons may also answer, all the other available resource persons. Mr. Chair, a while ago, that we could add the phrase "and subject to reciprocity" so that there will be other jurisdictions and our jurisdiction in the event that we do open up certain sections of our economy. I did some checking in Taiwan and Malaysia. Our neighbors have added this provision in their constitution when they did open. I would like to ask the opinion of first Professor Lutilia and, if possible, Justice Acuna, and adding this section there, Mr. Chair.
Secretary Lutilia, if you understand the question of
Yeah,
Kit
thank
Belmonte,
you,
may
Mr.
now
Chairman.
respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I caught the gist of Congressman Belmonte's questions. And while I do not disagree with that particular provision on reciprocity, I think it can be appropriately provided for in a law itself. So whenever, for instance, a law is passed, then Congress can provide for reciprocity there. But as a matter of easing the restrictions, I would prefer not to have it in the Constitution itself. We have had that reciprocity provision, for example, in the case of the practice of professions. So there is precedent for that being there. But as I've said, just for purposes of facilitating implementation, then we can speed it up by relegating it to the statutory enactments instead. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Are you done, Congressman Kit Belmonte?
If I could hear the opinion of other resource persons, that would be much help for me, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I'm not a resource person, but can I just offer an input?
The chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means, Kong Joey Salceda, you're now recognized.
Well, it was already a practice under TPP, which was abandoned by Trump, and now under RCEP. Such reciprocity actually is present, but I don't think we need to put it in the Constitution, because I'd rather leave it to the executive whether they wish to, they want to enter into such trading or economic partnership agreement. I'd rather give the greater flexibility, because from a practical point of view, if you look at our figures since 1945, We are not a net investing country. We are actually a net receiving country. So although I don't foreclose the possibility that at a certain point we might be on the other side, which means that we might need to invest. But I'd rather be silent because I'd rather that the executive has the capacity to enter into such agreements which may or may not require reciprocity. Yun lang po ang akin doon. Does RCEP require reciprocity? RCEP does not require reciprocity, but TPP does. So just an input lang, Kit. I'm not totally against it, but I'd rather give the flexibility to the executive.
Thank you, Chairman Joey. Medyo
Thank you, Chairman
kinakabahan ako
Joey.
dun sa
I'm looking
flexibility
forward
na yan.
for your sponsorship speech in the plenary.
Mandatory.
Congratulations to Create Bill. Let me acknowledge.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, but please allow me to acknowledge the Deputy Speaker, Rufus Rodriguez, former chair of this constitutional amendments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
Kongkit, are you done?
I could hear some more opinions on the matter, Mr. Chair. I would appreciate it, but that's my only question. Thank you for Professor Secretary Lutilia's position on the land. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now to ask question is Representative Gaite. You're now recognized, Congressman Gaite.
Salamat po, Mr. Chair, Pedro Garbin, sa lahat ng ating mga kapita-pitagang mga kasama sa Kongreso, gayon din sa ating mga esteemed guests. May mga ilang paulit-ulit na narinig ako sa mahabang debate. Ironically, we're talking about the Philippine Constitution, but of the Filipinos, and yet nag-usapan natin kung paano makakapasok ang foreigners, ang foreign direct investment sa ating bansa. Yung ating saligang batas na sanay saligang batas ng mamamayang Pilipino, ang inuna natin ngayon talakayin ay kung paano makapasok ang mga dayong kapital, lalo na sa panahon ng pandemya, lalo na sa matinding kawalan ng trabaho. Ngayon sa malaking pagbagsak ng ekonomiya, ang tanong ko nga essentially ay saan ba magagaling ang pag-unlad ng ating ekonomiya? Gusto ko lang i-point out na doon sa usapin ng FDI, parang paulit-ulit ang narrative that without FDIs, wala tayong aasahang economic development. At ngayon, especially during this pandemic, I believe that increasing FDI is not in itself necessary for development. Many other countries, such as South Korea and Taiwan, the last newly industrialized countries to graduate from a developed country status, were able to develop internally with this reliance on FDIs. In the 1970s, 1980s, yun sa datos ng UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade Development, they had growth rates of 7 to 10%. And yet, their FDIs only composed of about 0.5 to 0.4% in the case of Korea and Taiwan. In stark contrast, nabanggit na ng paulit-ulit ang ating mga kasamahan sa resource persons, ang FDI inflows natin for the past several years have increased threefold from averaging 1.6% of GDP between 2005 to 2019. So, generally, ang tingin po ng kinataong ito, FDIs is not in itself, is not in and of itself sufficient and developed as a prerequisite for development. Despite the numerous claims that nauhuli ang Pilipinas compared to ASEAN countries, which is true, but still, kung titignan natin yung inflows for the past several years, ay malaki ang itinaas. 30-fold from an annual average in 1980s of $187 million umaabot na ng 6.3 billion US dollars or 2% of our GDP. Ngayon, ang gusto ko lang i-clarify kung gayon. Una po, address sa ating mga proponents. Paulit-ulit nga na sinasabi na the charter the proposed amendments adding the proviso unless otherwise provided for by law, essentially removing the restrictive provisions supposedly in our constitution, magiging malaki ba ang tulong at ambag ng foreign direct investment sa ating ekonomiya, in the sense na nakita naman natin na hindi necessarily ito yung naging pamantayan ng pag-unlad ng mga ibang bansa. Anong tingin ng ating mga resource persons at sa naging karanasan ng nabanggit ko, yung Taiwan at South Korea, noong 1970s, 1980s, kung saan ang kanilang FDI lamang noon ay katumbas ng GDP na halos 0.4 to 0.5% lamang. Pero sila ay naging NIC. Ngayon, isa sa mga matatatag na ekonomiya ang South Korea at Taiwan. Naniniwala ang kantuang ito na ano ba ang role o factor ng FDIs sa pag-unlad ng ekonomiya, Mr. Chair, sa unang katanungan.
Thank you, Congressman Gaite. Now, to your question, it can be answered by, yes, all of the resource persons who are present can be answered by Secretary Lutilia.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Congressman Joey.
Unfortunately, I cannot upload my my presentation. But the presentation simply says it's not just about having FDI as a source of money, but as a source of competition. There is an international comparison from the OECD that the Philippines is being the most restricted results in higher oligopolies, lower investments, and therefore lower consumer welfare. Can I just show this slide? Just 1 second. Okay. Okay na ba? Here. So it's not just because it is a source of capital. It's really consumer welfare requires competition, and FDI restrictions protects the oligarchs, breeds oligopolies, and therefore reduces consumer welfare. That's my only argument, Your Honor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to our resident resource person, Congressman.
Thank you. Thank you for
Chairperson.
Thank you for
of
the
the Ways and Means,
clarification,
Congressman Salceda.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a comment? Is Dr.
Yes, Dr. Villegas, you may do so.
I've always stressed that this concept of Filipino first really has meant in our history, rich Filipinos first, damn the rest of us. If you take a look at what has happened by limiting strategic industries which are very capital intensive, Filipinos, only the rich do that. You cannot expect even the middle income and low income families to participate. And that is exactly what Congressman Salceda has been saying. We have one of the most oligopolistic structures in the developing world. We've allowed the elite to take over our economy in the name of Filipino first. So really, we have to redefine Filipino first as thinking of the welfare of the vast majority of Filipinos who are unemployed, who are poor, who need all the possible, especially long-term investments in telecom, in infrastructures, in media, and so on and so forth, so we can create employment opportunities for them and make the poor less poor. So I think this is the way we should define Filipino first, not limiting strategic industries to Filipinos, which will only benefit the rich and lead to monopoly and oligopoly. And so that's my response. And the constant reference to Taiwan and South Korea, let me now elaborate. It's a matter of really studying the process through which Taiwan and South Korea reached their first world status. In the 50s and the 60s, they were struggling and had very low domestic savings, as we had, as all poor countries in the beginning of the development process have. But because they followed the strategy of outward-looking, export-oriented industrialization, they were able to lift themselves by the bootstraps, so to speak, so that by the late 70s and the whole of the 80s and the 90s, when they were building bullet trains, the best infrastructures you can think of in this part of the world, their savings rate was already between 30 to 40%. They did not need FDIs to put up those infrastructures. We have not had the same success. And therefore, I don't think we can compare ourselves to South Korea and Taiwan. And let me just cite the most recent comparative data about foreign investments as a percentage of GDP in Southeast Asia. Cambodia, 53%. Indonesia, 20%. Laos, 32%. Malaysia, 41%. Singapore, obviously, 203%. Thailand, 40%. Vietnam, 60%. The average for Southeast Asia is 46%. Do you know what it is in the Philippines? 12.26%. Even Myanmar has a higher percentage of FDI to GDP, which is 16%. So let's not compare ourselves to Taiwan and South Korea. They're very different kettle of fish. And as I said, when they were ready to put up all the infrastructures towards real development, they had very high domestic savings rate. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Villegas.
Mr.
Congresswoman
Chair.
Stella Kimbo.
Yes, may I comment? Actually, Mr. Chair, in the interest of time, ayoko na sanang magsalita. Instead, I submitted a written expression of support to your committee. And kasama po sa aking liham po sa inyo, I attached a summary of 166 studies na ni-review ko po. Bilang isang ekonomista, I thought that it would be best to review the literature. And of those 160 plus studies, 127 of those would show support in favor of liberalization. So, ang punto ko po is, at this point in time, I think it's going to be impossible for us to convince our friends from the Bakabayan bloc that liberalization is good. Ang sinasabi ko lang is, why is it that the Constitution, as it is framed today, is decidedly against liberalization? Diba? Bawal ang 100% ownership, etc., etc. Right now, that's how it is framed. Ang sinasabi ko, given that meron namang evidence in support of liberalization, meron pa konti-konti ring against liberalization, ang importante at this point is we need flexibility. So ang RBH2 naman po, that's exactly the point of RBH2, which is to introduce flexibility. So sa ating kasama si Rep. Gaite, kung sakali naman po ay maging successful at maging batas po ito, we look forward to continued debates with you po on this matter. Thank you po, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Congresswoman Stella Kimbo.
Mr. Chair.
Congressman Gaide, are you done?
I have some follow-up questions, Mr. Chair.
You may proceed.
Yes, dun sa mga kasagutan, tama po, no? And we do agree that there is, sa sinabi po ni Dr. Villegas, no? Na yung problema ng oligopoly o duopoly in so many industries. And the only way around that is to address that in its face. Harapin, no? Yung problema ng oligopoly. Na ipagbawal nga, sabi nga ng ating saligang batas, no? Na ito ay pinagbabawal. Instead of simply adding foreign competition, which eventually will now monopolize the industries. As what has happened in so many other countries, no? Yung pagpasok ng mga bansa na ngayon sila ay nalagay sa kamay ng mga dayuhang kapital sa lahat ng larangan, sa trade, sa manufacturing, pati sa agriculture, no? Na ngayon yung inflow ng capital from China, which despite studies according to Congressman Stella Kimbo, other countries are now reverting back to more restriction on FDIs. Canada for one, France for one, and other countries, dahil ka nakita na nga nila in this supposed advent of neoliberal policies, nakita nga na nila yung nagiging problem, no? Yung unrestricted inflows, no? Na possibly even issues of security, health, for example, no? Yung production ng vaccine. So lahat yan ay nagiging principal na usapin ngayon ay paano pangangalagaan yung ekonomiya ng mga bansang ito, lalo na dito sa unrestricted inflows, no? Actually, yung inflows na hindi per se, we are not against foreign direct investments. For as long as these foreign direct investments directly have a concrete it will result in the improvement of our national economic program, pangangailangan ng ating bansa, hindi para sa interest ng ibang bansa. For as long as it will generate a development program that will improve generally our economy, yung tao, trabaho, increase of wages, nabanggit kanina yung savings, no? Pero for now, poverty, despite the past 40 years na neoliberal policies, we have not seen that. There's been no redistribution of wealth. Tama yung binanggit, concentrated pa rin sa ilan. And despite many changes, and now we're going again to the Constitution, I believe it will not result. We have been doing the same thing and not getting the same results. We're doing the same thing and not achieving the objective of redistributive wealth. Then something must be wrong. And more liberalization will not result to more improvement of our economy. Pantanong na, ilan na lang, absensya na Mr. Chair. Actually, malaman sana akong tanong.
Thank you, Congressman
Pero
Gaite.
po, opo, isang tanong na lang. Sabi ng UNCTAD, ngayon ay inaasahan because of the pandemic, because of the effect on the economy, nabanggit kanino nung ating tagapagsalita from PCCI that particularly the MSMEs have been suffering very much during this pandemic. Kahit yung foreign direct investments, inaasahan nga babagsak, no, for the next couple of years. Sabi ni Congressman Salceda, ang factor or major variable is the vaccine. Meaning, kung may ma-develop na vaccine na mahusay, hopefully ma-address kagad ito, then well and good. But malaking if yun, ano? Because alam na natin yung problema ng rollout, production problems. Now with the new variant, we still do not know. There's so much up in the air that we cannot really project how the vaccine or other measures can address the current problem of the pandemic. Pero sabi nga dito, babagsak pa nga ang FDIs. No? Paano ngayon ito? Bakit ngayon kailangan baguhin economic provisions? Kaya yung globally ay bagsak nga. Sinasabi nyo, we have to prepare for now. Kasi prospectively, pag natapos na yung pandemya, dapat handang-handa na tayo. Pero now, yung current na sitwasyon, nabanggit na no, ng PCCI, anong tulong directly pwede natin ibigay sa MSMEs. We had Bayanihan 1, we had Bayanihan 2, now in-approve yung CREATE. Pero yung MSMEs which generate the largest population of our Filipinos, create the greatest wealth, contribute the most taxes, hanggang ngayon wala pa rin sila. And hopefully that would have redound to our workers, to our ordinary people. Mataas ang presyo ng mga bilihin dahil bagsak ang ating small producers.
Congressman Gaite, can you please shorten your question and direct your question to the resource person? Thank you very much.
ano ang premise ngayon na bakit kailangan baguhin ngayon yung Constitution, which I still also believe is divisive because in the last 2018 Pulse Asia survey, only 66% supported, 66% opposed the charter change. Only 1 out of every 3 agreed to it, but 2 out of every 3 disagreed. So this is a very divisive issue. So ngayon babaguhin natin yung Constitution. Mr. Chair, Pangulo lang, tama ba? Baguhin natin yung Constitution ngayon that it will divide the people again, lalo na when all hands on deck should be focused on the pandemic, and yet we'll be throwing another monkey wrench in the economic and political hoopla and create further problems for people. Yun na lang po, huling panghuli, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anybody from the resource person who would like to respond?
Mr. Chair, can I respond to that? Dr.
Yes,
Villegas?
Congressman, no, sorry, Professor Villegas, you're now recognized.
What is different today is that it is so important for us to continue the build program for the next 20 years. We're so behind infrastructures, as you can see, just travel around, even Vietnam, Thailand, that are not yet at the category of Taiwan and South Korea, have much better infrastructures. And our government is struggling to go into the build program. They're borrowing right now very much because it's the only way they can continue. We need all the possible private capital. As I said, we don't have too many Ramon Angs in this country who can actually commit long-term capital. And our Northeast are the large countries that have succeeded in infrastructure development: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. And they're oozing with long-term capital because their population is diminishing so rapidly that really they don't have too many opportunities now to invest in their countries. And they're looking precisely not only to invest, but to bring their technology, which we must emphasize is part of the reason why we want to attract FDIs. It's technology, it's not only capital. So that is what is different today and in the next 10 to 20 years. We have to revise the Constitution to make possible the inflow of more long-term capital, specifically in telecom, in infrastructures like airports, in media, which is now merging with the IT sector. These are all capital intensive. We don't have the private capital to get into this. Thank you very much.
Dr. Villegas, my observation is despite the continued economic growth, sustained economic growth for the past 15 years, it does not, it was not able to address the inequality and poverty. Ano sa tingin niyo ho yung gap doon sa
the main reason, and is something else that we have to address, is that we have criminally neglected rural and agricultural development. And this is where I see that the government is doing the right thing. If you take a look, and since you have very close observation of the operating budget of the government, more and more of the so-called build budget for infrastructure is in the countryside. We should have done this 20 years ago. Farm to market roads, irrigation systems. Why is there poverty in the Philippines? Because we have completely neglected the countryside. And our obsession with industrialization in Metro Manila, the countryside did not get the necessary resources for the poor farmers to make their land productive. And so what is the solution to poverty? Make sure we are able to improve agricultural productivity with the appropriate investments in the rural areas. We will never be able to reduce poverty because 75% of them are rural areas if we don't improve our agricultural sector. Thank you.
Are you also of the view, Dr. Villegas, that the past 10 or 15 years of sustained economic growth was led by consumption-led growth rather than investment-led growth? Is that true?
Exactly. 75% can be attributed to consumption. And most of them really were coming from the remittances of overseas workers. So these are the ones who really have saved our country. You know? When people who are relatives of FWs receive their remittances, they spend them. And even though they have some savings, as I said in the last hearing, their savings are very short term. They cannot be invested in airports, telecom. And so you're right. Our economy right now is basically supported by consumption. We have to improve significantly the investment side. The government is doing whatever it can, but with its limits. And so we need private sector investment, and FDIs can supplement our local sources of long-term capital.
Thank you very much, Dr. Villegas. Anyone from the resource person who wish to respond to the query of Congressman Gaite?
No, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
On Forbes.
Mr. Forbes, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning and greetings to all the many members of the committee and others that are attending the hearing today. I just wanted to actually go back to the previous comments on reciprocity, first from my good friend Justice Escuna, and also from Congressman Belmonte in regards to your father, please, Kong Kip. And that is, I don't think that's, I agree with Kong Joyce Oseda that that should not be in the Constitution. It really limits the future. And specifically in the TPP, which is now being studied by the DTI as to whether or not to join, even without the United States, which gives access to Mexico and Canada on a free trade basis. There is a provision for free cross-border investment flow. And also, if you had that in terms of China, China has a very restricted economy, in part because it has a huge domestic market. And you would limit potential Chinese investment into the Philippines. Secondly, I'd also like to bring to the attention of the committee what Indonesia is doing. They very aggressively are reducing restrictions. They're a very controlled and regulated economy, as in the Philippines, but they're aggressively reducing them to a very, very minimum. And secondly, they're establishing a $100 billion sovereign investment fund to help invest in their build. And their build already includes a bullet train between Jakarta and Bandung. That's a short one. And President Widodo has the ambition to build an east-west one across the entire island of Java, which has a population of the size of the Philippines. And then finally, I'd like to also bring to the attention that I agree with Dr. Vega's analysis of how Korea and Japan and Taiwan exported themselves from poverty to wealth. And the Philippines does not have an orientation towards that. Even today, 3/4 of the total exports of goods and services come from foreign investment, not from domestic firms. And I am quite impressed that Vietnam, the Ayala of Vietnam, announced last week that it will be exporting SUVs that are very sophisticated. They're not AI, but they're the most advanced cars in terms of electronics that are going. And the Philippines has not exported vehicles since one of our member companies, Ford, decided to close down when they put up a plant down in Laguna because they could not obtain enough parts locally. So they moved the production. They were exporting to South Africa and Indonesia. They moved the production to Thailand, which manufactures 2 million cars a year and has 4,000 companies in a cluster. So I would agree with that analysis of Dr. Villegas that it's a consumption-driven economy. And in order to get rich, no country has not passed through a manufacturing and industrialization phase. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes. And thank you, Congressman Gaiti. Now, the next or the last to ask question for this period of interpellation is Congressman Lo Fortun. Congressman Fortun, you are now recognized. But before you proceed, let me acknowledge Deputy Speaker Mikey Romero Deputy Majority Leader Sharky Palma, Congressman Acosta, and Congressman Kiko Benitez. Congressman Fortun, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Congressman and Deputy Speaker Wes Gatchalian pala, nandito na. Sorry. Law, please
Yes, may I
proceed.
proceed, Mr. Chair? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, Mr. Chair. Let me start by saying that I am in complete agreement with the contention that it is already high time, in fact, already long overdue, that we revisit the economic provisions of the 1987 Constitution and consider introducing amendments to encourage and facilitate the pouring in of more investments into the country. We know that being part of a global value chain, the Philippines ought to be responsive to the developments in the global economic markets. Nevertheless, Mr. Chair, while it is important that our Constitution has to be dynamic and provide for some flexibility, it is critical that the fundamental law of our land should promote stability, accountability, and hence credibility. So the Constitution, therefore, Mr. Chair, must be secure to provide for a framework that is dynamic but relatively stable and resilient against abuse and manipulation. And by stable and dynamic, it means that the Constitution provides for clear parameters, but predictable enough to foster long-term planning for government, our citizens, and even investors. In other words, Mr. Chair, the Constitution may give to Congress the power to introduce legislations, to pursue constitutional policies, but definitely not to completely depart from constitutional policies laid down in the Constitution. Mr. Chair, I tried to go over certain provisions of the Constitution, and there are only like 5 instances in the 1987 Constitution where the words or phrase, unless otherwise provided by law, are there. We have, Mr. Chair, the term of office of the senators shall be 6 years and shall commence unless otherwise provided by law at noon on the 13th day of June. So ibig sabihin, Congress may provide for a different date, for a different time and date, but it cannot depart from the constitutional policy laid down there. Another provision would be that the House of Representatives shall be elected for a term of 3 years, which shall begin at noon on the 13th day of June next following the election. Yun na din po ang pagkakataon na pwede, but not really a complete departure. Then, the Constitution also provides that unless otherwise provided by law, the regular election centers and the members of the House shall be held on the second Monday of May. But necessarily, elections have to be held. In other words, Mr. Chair, yung mga unless otherwise provided by law sa ating Constitution ay nakalagay not to give Congress the authority to completely depart from the constitutional policy laid down in the Constitution, but to actually facilitate a more efficient implementation of a constitutional policy. And all the rest, Mr. Chair, if you would look at the Constitution, wala nang nakalagay unless otherwise provided by law. Lahat puro na as may be provided by law. In other words, Congress is given the power to legislate to pursue constitutional policies. Now, Mr. Chair, ang kinakakabahala ko lang, Mr. Chair, yung complete na blanket authority. We're not saying that we should not amend the Constitution. As I said, I agree that we have to revisit and already introduce amendments. But I think, Mr. Chair, we have to listen to the proposals of our resource persons to put in place also in the Constitution certain parameters, certain limitations, certain policies, not just provide there unless otherwise provided by law. Because in that case, Mr. Chair, we're giving Congress complete blanket authority to pursue certain provisions or policies that may not be in consonance with the intent of our Constitution. In other words, Mr. Chair, while I support this resolution, I would propose, Mr. Chair, that we tackle further each provision and allow the introduction of amendments to the resolution so that we don't simply give Congress complete latitude, blanket authority to legislate on these issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to hear from our resource persons.
Thank you, Congressman Lo Fortun. the Deputy Minority Leader, your manifestation is duly noted. Now, since Kong Lu Fortun is our last to ask question, let me just inform this committee and those who are in attendance that today, or this meeting, is the 8th meeting of the RBH2. It is being deliberated. 3 meetings were held with other measures, 2 out-of-town consultations, and 2 meetings where RBH was exclusively discussed. Out of these in-house and regional consultations, the committee endeavored to invite all sectors of society, from civil groups, the academe, the legal luminaries, political scientists, the economists, business groups, to pertinent government agencies and sound policy research institutions. The same groups were also consulted in previous Congresses. In the 18th Congress alone, more than 50 individuals and organizations were consulted on amendments to the economic provisions in the Constitution. To all the resource persons and guests who are with us today and during the previous meeting, please accept my gratitude for your participation. Your inputs and insights will serve as the guiding light for this committee as it moves forward in the deliberations of resolution of both houses of Congress number 2. Maraming salamat po sa lahat ng nagbigay ng kanilang oras. You may now leave the Zoom.
Mr.
Since
Chair?
the period of, yes?
Mr. Chair, may I hear some reactions from our resource persons regarding my manifestation?
Regarding your manifestation, okay, for the final reactions on the manifestation of Congressman Lo Fortun, anyone from the resource person still present in Zoom may respond.
Mr. Chair.
Attorney Villegas, Congressman Villegas, Professor Villegas. Sino yung gusto magsalita? Attorney Abad.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, this is in reaction to also previous comments and reiterating some of the principles that I raised in the last hearing. Without getting bogged down in the debate regarding foreign direct investment, you know, how much restriction, what we do. I want to go back and reiterate that what makes a good constitution is what we should first look at, because the constitution has a fundamental purpose, which is really to organize society and to be as inclusive as possible. So it's a badly written constitution. I think we admitted that last time, hastily put together in 1986. And there was plenty of compromise and insertions that I would consider as improper legislation by the Constitutional Commission. But there were political reasons for rushing that document back in 1986. And so we find ourselves now at the mercy of this badly written constitution. The first order of the day is really, there is an urgent need to correct and revise the constitution, and we have the right to do that as a people. No, so it's no parties or particular interest that should be considered. Just really that we have to have a better constitution, and a good constitution should not legislate equity restrictions in the organic charter. These are things that should be left to the legislature and the executive. Then you can continue the debate on whether it should be 60-40, 51-49, or whatever permutation of the restriction there should be. Then there is also a question about whether equity restriction is an effective way of keeping the economy in the hands of Filipinos. If you want to have proper regulation, then you don't do it by coming up with an arbitrary figure like 60 or 40. It's an unscientific way of restricting investment. There are better ways to do it, and I think Congress and the executive would be probably better placed to really talk about it. When you legislate in a constitution like that, what they did in the CONCOM, you're admitting minority opinions and forcing it on the majority. So constitutional principle calls for the Congress now to do this heroic task of fixing the Constitution, which should have been fixed a long time ago. So that's without, not without going into this debate on FDI. But let me add, before I end, that FDI actually brings other benefits rather than simply capital accumulation. China and Vietnam accumulated enough capital, but foreign capital or FDI also brings with it technology, which they will be willing to share if capital is allowed, and competition, which is very important in a market-based economy. That's all, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair,
Thank you, Attorney Abad. Congressman Fortun.
Mr. Chairman, can I say something? Gary Teves.
Professor Villegas, is that you?
No, Gary Teves.
Secretary Gary Teves, you're now recognized.
Yeah, just to sort of help summarize the discussion and the intervention of our resource speakers, I'd like to briefly state that when you look at the budget, Mr. Chairman, which you are familiar with, and all the rest of our colleagues, you will have discussed this, that the investment or the expenditures for health as a percent of the economy or GDP, as well as the per capita expenditures, are really much lower than those being provided by our ASEAN peers. If you can imagine that because of the health issue, the government has to spend more on health, and unfortunately, even the budget for agriculture has been reduced. To that extent, if the foreign investors can come in and supplement the resources needed for the build, and infrastructure, that will help result in a more sustainable growth in our economy. So there is this partnership and complementation, but it should really be done. And that's the reason why some of us, including myself, would have preferred that the restrictive economic provisions be outright removed, and subsequent Congresses can impose the limit regulations on the removed economic provisions. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Secretary Gary Teves.
Mr. Chair, just one last question,
Chairman.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Kong Fortun, would you allow other resource person to respond to your manifestation?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Yes. Can you please identify yourself? Hindi ko makita sa screen.
Sorry.
Mr. Chair.
Kong Sharon?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Kong Sharon, yes.
I just wanted to react to Kong Fortun's that when we were studying the Public Service Act, what is done as a safeguard, Kong Fortun, is there are laws that are safeguards already. Like in the US, they have the CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investments in the US, which is dynamic because, for example, when 9/11 happened, then they changed their laws, not the constitution, to adjust to the demands of the time. So there are safeguards that Congress can pass. Or in fact, the EU also has restrictions, and it changes over time. At the end, they want more green investments or investments in energy, but the safeguards as well as the restrictions should be dynamic as well, I would say. So that's how other countries do that. Ina-adjust na rin nila on what the time needs. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Congressman.
Mr. Chair.
One at a time.
Congressman Kong Kaloy.
Congressman Salceda to be followed by Kong Kaloy Sarate. Congressman Salceda, you are now recognized.
Yung restrictions, hindi pwede arbitrary eh. That's number one. Dapat may empirical basis. Pangalawa, you must restrict the few, not the many. So, yun nangyari sa Constitution, makikita mo na nire-restrict natin yung many on behalf of the few. I'll just give you one example. Trade openness. the Philippines is second to the last most open out of 152 countries. Our average is only 62%. The international average is 91.7%. So that is as a result, an outcome that can be directly attributed to the kind of constitution that we have made for ourselves. So yun lang po ang gusto ko sana maano na based on outcome and based on a priori principles, restrictions should not be arbitrary, and restriction should restrict the few, not the many, which is what we did with this constitution. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Kong Joey. Kong Sarate to be followed by Kong Kit Belmonte.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a reaction dun sa manifestation din ni Kong Lau Fortun and the statement of Attorney Abad. I disagree that yung sinabi ni Attorney Abad na yung opinion ng minority ay pinasunod doon sa majority when we ratify the Constitution. That's precisely what the constitutional commissioners then did was to present this to our people. And our people certainly agreed na this is the policy that should be laid down in our Constitution. I don't think that is arbitrary when we say we have to protect our national patrimony by placing in our Constitution some citizenship requirements, not in all aspects of our economy, but in some important sectors of our economy. Now, second, Mr. Chair, they have been saying that we need FDIs, we need FDIs. Ngayon, hindi ko ata matanto yan dahil since 1991, when we passed the Foreign Investment Act of 1991, our economy is so liberalized even under this regime of the 1987 Constitution, where we have a supposed protectionist provision. Napaka-liberalized lang. And in fact, our colleagues just admitted na they can pass laws to further liberalize our economy. Just recently, we passed the amendments to the Public Service Act. There was this CREATE, there was this Bill on Guide, and several others. We even expanded the coverage of the Investment Act of 1991. So that is our point. Why is there a need to amend the Constitution now? And malinaw na lumalabas na, Mr. Chair, na yung sinasabing flexibility is only a ruse. The real purpose is really ibigay tayo doon sa dayuhan. In fact, there are those who are now advocating na wag na lang unless otherwise provided by law. Talagang tanggalin na natin yung 60-40 na yan outrightly. At yun ang aming pinangangambahan dyan, Mr. Chair, na ito ay talagang magbubukas ng oportunidad while the other jurisdictions are going back to protectionist regime, dahil nga sa nangyaring ito ngayon, lalong-lalo na itong worldwide crisis na pinadala ng pandemya ng COVID. Here we are opening up, ibubuyang-yang natin ang ating national patrimony for further pillage and plunder of just to so-called FDIs to come in. Yung FDIs na yan, kung titingnan naman natin, ay talagang tumataas siya. But the real question here, nag-redound ba yan doon sa pag-unlad ng ating ekonomiya in this past several decades? So yun siguro ang dapat tingnan natin, Mr. Chair. We have been liberalizing our economy, but it did not redound to the benefits of our people even. Look at our agriculture. So yun ang dapat nating pagtuunan ng pansin rather than spending time on this exercise to amend our Constitution at this late hour. So yun lang yung manifestation ko, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kong Sarate. I beg to disagree to your manifestation that there will be a wholesale of our national patrimony or economy when you stated that ito ipamimigay sa ating mga dayuhan. In fact, the only proposal pending now before this committee and the exclusive proposal of RBH2 is to insert the phrase unless otherwise provided by law. Meaning, if this proposal will be approved by the people in a plebiscite called for that purpose, then Congress will have a leeway and the flexibility
Mr. Chair.
to think
Mr.
of
Chair,
those legislations
Mr. Chair.
that will respond to the present economic conditions. Deputy Speaker Atienza, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just would like to express my strongest reaction to the statement of my colleague, Congressman Zarate. We're not talking about opening the country for pillage and plunder, as he termed it. Sana po hindi ganun ang ating pananaw, sapagkat ang ating kagustuhan dito ay matulungan ang ekonomiya sa panahon ng pandemya at pagkatapos po nito, pagbangon ng Pilipinas to another level of economic prosperity. At this point in time, Mr. Chairman, we've listened to all our resource persons. We thank them for their experiences, their wisdom, and understanding of the issues. And we have heard also from our colleagues express their explanation of their votes already. At this point, we would like to move forward so that we may move forward to approve or disapprove the subjects in our hands now.
Mr. Chair.
Continue this debate.
Mr. Chair,
which is
just as
not
one
leading
last
to
question,
anything.
Chair.
We would probably break apart, misunderstanding each other. I reject the words pillage and plunder. We're not talking about that.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you
Mr.
very
Chair,
much.
I still have the floor, Mr. Chair.
Deputy
Just one
Speaker
last.
Lito Atienza.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Can I now acknowledge?
Hindi kasi natapos yung sa akin, Mr. Chair. Ang dami kasi interjections.
Okay, please wind up, Congressman Fortun, so I can now acknowledge Congressman Kit Belmonte.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Ang gusto ko lang marinig sa ating resource persons, Mr. Chair. Nakita naman nila yung kopya ng ating RBH2. May mga proposals kanina na hindi lang siya ganun kasimpleng lagyan ng unless otherwise provided by law, but certain provisions have to be added. Purposely to avoid defeating the bedrock provisions of the Constitution and other important policies that should be permanent in nature. Now, ang gusto ko marinig sa kanila, sa tingin nyo ba, as it is crafted now, should this resolution be already approved by the committee or does the resolution need improvement bago natin aprobahan? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I think it's not the resource person who will say that the committee should approve it. It should be the members who should decide.
No, I know that, Mr. Chair, but we want to hear your opinion, Mr. Chair.
For
We just want to
adoption
hear your
to the
opinion, Mr. Chair.
Committee.
Chair.
Thank you, Congressman Fortun. Congressman Kit Belmonte, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maikli lang, gusto ko lang susugan sana yung sinabi ni Kong Lo. Listening to all our resource persons, it seems to me clear, hindi necessary yung pagbigay natin ng land. Hindi necessary ibigay natin yung land to allow foreign investments. At the same time, we protect our national patrimony as propounded by Congressman Defensor before that. However, I do feel, and most of the resource persons also state this, except for the resource persons who want to open up everything blanket, are saying na medyo kapos yung unless otherwise provided by law. I myself am kind of restricted because as Justice Ascuna stated, this was first proposed in the House under Speaker Sonny Belmonte. In fact, this is almost exactly the same bill as proposed by Speaker Sonny Belmonte. However, I do believe that there are certain provisions that there are certain restrictions that will not contradict the intent of the Constitution and all of us will agree on. And these are the stuff that we are afraid of for legislation further may suddenly give up. So I do not see the problem by adding the guidelines of national security, for example, as stated by Congressman Salceda, our long-term interest and empirical data, and also the point of reciprocity. As I stated, I do have to check, but I understand similar jurisdictions, our neighbors, have added these requirements in their fundamental laws, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
So,
thank you, Kongkit. The principle
Chair,
of
Mr. Chair.
is already enshrined under the Constitution. Now, as to whether we will add that provision in the proposed amendment, unless otherwise, the phrase unless otherwise provided by law, it is of my view that it should be better left when we legislate pertaining to the amendments in the Constitution. Kung ito naman ay maaprubahan ng taong bayan sa isang plebisito, itong proposal na ito, at maging isang ganap na amendment, then by the time we legislate, isasama natin doon yung pwede, yung usapin sa principle of reciprocity, national security, and of course, the protection of our national sovereignty. Congressman Mike Arroyo, you're now recognized.
Mr. Chair, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I just want to follow the line of thought of the Deputy Speaker Atienza. We have debated upon this for so many hours and for many years already, Mr. Chair. I think it's time we move forward. That let's either approve this or turn it down. Mr. Chair, I move that we just go to a vote already.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Congressman Mike Arroyo. Deputy Speaker Marcoleta, you are now recognized. You want to say something?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Considering the instructive, constructive, and even exhaustive deliberations we had on RBH2, and with the participation of numerous resource persons discussing both sides of the coin, I now respectfully move to adopt it, Mr. Chair.
There is a motion for
I
the
object.
adoption of RBH2. Is there any objection?
Mr. Chairman, before we
Objection,
proceed
Mr.
with
Speaker.
the
Mr.
adoption
Chair,
of
objection.
resolution of both houses number 2, may I propose certain amendments before we consider the approval of the resolution of both houses number 2.
Mr. Chair.
You may,
Thank you,
Congressman.
Mr. Chair. Before we proceed with the consideration, I move to exclude item number 3 of resolution of both houses number 2 on the proposed amendment which seeks to amend section 7 of Article 12 on national patrimony, national economy and patrimony, which pertains or relates to the ownership of land in the Philippines.
Second.
So, Mr. Speaker, Mr.
I
Chairman.
second the amendment. I second the amendment, Mr. Chair.
The
Congressman.
amendment to RBH2 excluding the proposed amendment on Section 7 of the 1987 Constitution was moved by Congressman Noy Defensor and was seconded by severally seconded by
Salceda.
Congressman Keith Belmonte, Kong Joey Salceda, Kong Wes
Salo.
Gatchalian, Deputy Speaker B.H. Herrera,
Deputy
and all others
Congressman
who are
Albano.
present.
Gonzalo.
Congressman Albano, let's just manifest your acquiescence to the Viber thread para ma-record po natin. Hindi ko makita lahat. So, Deputy Speaker Marcoleta,
I will still move for the adoption with that particular amendment, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, just a proposed amendment on
Congressman-
Section 2, Article 3. As stated earlier by Justice Escuna, we also have to be careful where we place the phrase unless otherwise provided by law. May I just propose that the fourth sentence of Section 2 be made a separate paragraph? Because Section 2 states all lands of public domain, waters, mineral, coal, petroleum, and other mineral oils, and all sources of potential energy, fisheries, forests, timber, wildlife, flora, and fauna, and natural resources are owned by the state. With the exception of agricultural lands, all other natural resources shall not be alienated. The exploration, development, and utilization of natural resources shall be under the full control and supervision of the state. This power should remain permanent. Kasi baka ma-confuse kung hindi natin hihiwalay. Ang alam ko, ang gusto naman natin gawin is yung gawing flexible yung yung ownership. So it only pertains to the sentence. The state may directly undertake such activities or it may enter into co-production, joint venture or production sharing agreements with the Filipino citizens or corporations or association, at least 60% of whose capital is owned by such citizens unless otherwise provided by law. So ang proposal ko is just make that fourth sentence a separate paragraph, just to be clear.
Congressman Noy.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, while we note the request of the Honorable Suntay, we have a pending motion right now which has been duly seconded. May I request that it be resolved before we proceed with the motion of Honorable Bong Suntay?
The motion of Congressman Noy's defensor is to exclude from the proposal
Section 7
Section 7
of
of
Article 12 on land.
Article 12 of the 1987 Constitution, particularly on the conveyance of private land. It was severally seconded. There being no objection, the motion is now approved. Now we go to the main motion. The main motion is
Mr.
for the
Chair.
adoption.
Mr. Chair,
My proposed amendment, just to make it a separate paragraph, starting from the fourth sentence.
Second
So
the motion.
just to provide clarity that it only involves that phrase only involves the restrictive provision on ownership.
Any second to the motion of Congressman Bong Suntay?
We second the motion.
Gonzalo, second the
Chair,
motion.
second.
Second.
It was severally seconded. Any objection? The motion is hereby approved. Now we go to the main motion.
Mr. Chair, before we proceed, we have some few formal amendments just to perfect the resolution before we approve it in its entirety. I move that the title of the resolution be amended to reflect the proper wording such that the title will read Resolution of both Houses proposing amendments to certain economic provisions, particularly Articles 12, 14, and 16 of the 1987 Constitution of the Republic of the Philippines. Second, Mr. Chair, on line 6 of page 2, I move that the words national patrimony and economy be deleted and changed to national economy and patrimony. And on line 29, I move that the same amendment be made. So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chair.
Second.
It has been severally seconded. The motion is hereby approved. We now go to the main motion. The main motion is for adoption of resolution of both houses number 2 with
Mr. Chair.
amendment as approved.
Mr. Chair. Second the
Mr.
motion.
Chair, I am registering my objection. I am objecting, Mr. Chair.
Wala pa tayo sa voting. Magtatawag pa lang.
Mauuna po ba yung objection? Kasi rin butuhan?
So,
we are raising a prejudicial and basic.
No, yes.
Magbutuhan muna tayo.
So let's divide the House.
There was a
Those who are in
motion, and I am
favor
objecting on the
of
motion.
the adoption of resolution of both houses number 2, please say aye if you are physically present here.
Aye.
And those who
Aye.
want to register their votes in the constitutional amendments thread, you may do so. Kasi yung iba hindi naka-online pero hindi naka-video.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Chair.
we have a quorum in fact, Mr. Chair.
We will
call for
suspend for 5 minutes to give this committee secretariat to determine the votes of the respective members. The hearing is suspended for 5 minutes. amendments to certain economic provisions of the 1987 Constitution of the Republic of the Philippines, particularly Article 12, 14, and 16 as amended is now approved. Congratulations. Happy Constitution Day to all of you.
Yes,
But
May
we
we
are
know
not done
the
yet because we
may
need
we know the votes again, Mr. Chair?
to
Mr. Chair,
approve the
may we know the result of the votes again?
Yung negative votes.
The result shows that there are 62 affirmative votes, 2 in the negative, 3 abstention.
May I know how my vote was registered, Mr. Chair?
Sorry, there is a slight correction. In the negative, there are 3. The vote of Kong Sarate was not counted, and now it is being counted. So to repeat, 62 in the affirmative, 3 negative, 3 abstention. The motion is approved.
Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr.
Now-
Chairman,
Yes.
this is Congressman Estrella.
Deputy Speaker Estrella, please.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, may I move that all members present who voted in the affirmative be made co-authors of this resolution.
Is there any objection? There being none, the motion by Congressman Deputy Speaker Estrella is now approved. We now go to the approval of the committee report. The committee secretariat is hereby directed to show in the screen the committee report hard copies of which are being provided here in Andaya Hall for those who are physically present. The committee reports recommends to plenary the adoption of RBH2 with the deletion of the proposed amendment in number 3 in the original resolution on Section 7, Article 12 on conveyance of private lands. Members of the committee, please go over the said committee report. And to give time to the members to study.
Mr. Chair, may we also
report.
request that the committee report be uploaded in our Viber.
Yes. The committee secretariat is
so that we
hereby
can-
directed to upload the soft copy of the committee report in the 18th Congress Constitutional Committee Viber thread.
Mr. Chair, may I move to approve the committee report?
Is there any objection? There being none,
Objection.
I object, Mr. Chair. Just for record.
I object. For the record.
okay, let's divide the House. Those who are in favor
Mr. Chair.
to approve the committee report, please say aye.
Aye.
Those who disapprove, please say nay.
Point of order,
Nay.
Mr.
Nay.
The ayes have it.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
What's the point of order?
There were several amendments, both propounded by Congressman Suntay and Congressman Noy Defensor, who were
I-incorporate sila pag in-elevate sa...
The committee report was shown in the screen, copies of which were distributed in this Andaya Hall. Those who are physically present were given a copy, soft copy of which were forwarded to the Viber thread of the Committee on Constitutional Amendments.
So, just to be clear, Mr. Chair, the amendments will be added. It
Yes.
just means na nauna yung committee report.
No,
bago lumabas
as I
yung
have
mga
said
amendments.
earlier, Congressman Kit Belmonte, the committee report as shown in the screen and forwarded in our Viber thread already incorporated the deletion of the proposed amendment in number 3 in the original resolution, which is in the conveyance of public of private lands. Now, as to the other amendments, typographical formal amendments, it will be incorporated also. Thank you very much. And since the ayes have it, the committee report is now approved. Any motion for adjournment?
Mr. Chair, may I move that we adjourn?
Second.
Second, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair.
I object.
Thank you very much. The motion is now carried. This meeting is now adjourned.
Congratulations, Mr. Chair.
Congratulations, Mr. Chair.
Congratulations sa atin lahat. And happy Constitution Day.
Congratulations, Chair, and to all our colleagues.
Dito tayo.
Congratulations. Have lunch.